First, Cowboy bought an abandoned farm, but two Apache women already lived there, thirsty for a man. John had always dreamed of having his own land. From the time he was a young boy, he had watched his father ride horses across the wide fields of their small town. He loved the smell of fresh earth, the sound of wind whistling through the trees, and the quiet that came after a long day of work. John knew that one day he wanted a farm of his own, a place where he could wake up to the sun rising over the hills and work with his hands to build something lasting.
That dream never left him, even as he grew older and worked many jobs.
For years he had saved every penny he could, working as a ranch hand, fixing fences and tending cattle. Life was not easy. Rise. Some days he barely made enough to pay for food or clothes, but he never gave up. Every evening, when he sat by the fire, he would close his eyes and imagine the farm he would one day own. He imagined planting crops, raising animals, and having a small barn with a loft where he could store hay. He imagined nights spent under the stars, listening to the wind in the trees, and days filled with the satisfaction of work done well. One chilly morning, as the sun barely touched the horizon, John rode into town with a letter in his pocket. It was a letter from the bank, confirming that his long-awaited dream could finally become reality. He had enough money to buy a piece of land, a farm that had been abandoned for many years. The farm was far from the town, on the edge of the rolling hills, where the grass grew tall and wild. John felt a rush of excitement and nervousness all at once. His hands shook slightly as he held the letter, and his heart pounded in his chest. Grasp. After all the years of waiting, it was finally happening. The journey to the farm was long and quiet. Bright. John rode his horse along dusty trails, past fields where wildflowers grew in bright colors. He passed old fences, broken down from years of neglect, and a few abandoned houses that reminded him of forgotten dreams. The closer he got to his farm, the more his heart raced. Finally, as the sun climbed higher into the sky, he saw it. The farm lay before him like a forgotten treasure. The fields were overgrown with tall grass, the barn had holes in the roof, and the farmhouse looked empty and tired. But to John, it was perfect. It was a canvas waiting for him to paint his future on. John spent the first day walking through the land. He opened the creaking gates and stepped carefully over rocks and weeds. He went into the old barn and ran his hand over the rough wooden beams. Dust floated in the sunlight, and the smell of old wood filled his nose. He could almost see the farm in its former glory, with animals in the pens and fields neatly tilled. He imagined himself fixing the fences, planting rows of vegetables, and feeding chickens in the early morning. For the first time in years, John felt a deep, pure happiness. Even though the farm needed a lot of work, John felt ready. He began planning how he would restore the land. He thought about where to plant crops, where to put the animals, and how to repair the barn. Every detail mattered to him. As he walked through the fields, he imagined the seasons changing. Spring with new growth, summer with long sunny days, autumn with golden leaves, and winter with snow covering the ground. He imagined how different the farm would look with each season, and his excitement grew. John spent the night in the farmhouse, which was empty and quiet. The floorboards creaked under his weight, and the wind whistled through broken windows. At first he felt a little lonely, but then he realized that the silence was a gift. It was a chance to start fresh, without distractions or noise. He lit a small fire in the fireplace and sat by it, thinking about the work ahead. He knew that restoring the farm would be difficult, but he was determined. This was his dream, and he was ready to make it real. The next morning, John began exploring every corner of the farm. He found an old well, dry but still solid, and thought about how it could provide water once he cleaned it. He found a small garden behind the house, overgrown with weeds, and imagined it full of vegetables. He even found a few old tools in the barn, rusty but usable. Each discovery made him feel more connected to the farm. He felt like he was uncovering the history of the land and preparing to add his own chapter to it. As he worked, John thought about the freedom of life on a farm. He loved the idea of being able to make his own decisions, follow his own schedule, and create something with his own hands. He loved the thought of waking up every morning to the sun, feeling the wind on his face, and knowing that his hard work would produce real results. For years he had dreamed of this life, and now it was no longer a dream. It was his reality. Despite the excitement, John knew he would face challenges. The farm was abandoned for a reason, and it would not be easy to fix it. The fences were broken. The soil was dry in some areas, and the barn needed serious repairs. But John did not let the challenges discourage him. Instead, he felt motivated. Each problem was a chance to prove himself and show what he could do. He had spent his life preparing for this moment, and he was ready to meet it head-on. By the end of the second day, John had cleared a small area to plant his first seeds. He set up a temporary shelter in the barn and began to organize his tools. Every task, no matter how small, gave him a sense of accomplishment. He felt connected to the land in a way he had never felt before. It was not just about owning property, it was about belonging, creating, and being part of something bigger than himself. As the sun set over the hills, John sat on the porch of the farmhouse and looked at the land. The sky turned shades of orange and pink, and the wind carried the scent of wildflowers and fresh earth. He felt a deep peace mixed with excitement for the future. He knew that this was the beginning of a long journey, one that would require patience, hard work, and dedication. But he also knew that he was ready. For the first time in his life, he felt truly at home. Little did John know, the farm held more surprises than he had ever imagined. The land was not as empty as it seemed. Something, or someone, was already living there, quietly waiting. But for now, John's heart was full of hope, determination, and the joy of a dream finally coming true. He did not yet know that this farm, which he had waited for his whole life to own, would change in ways he could never have expected. John went to bed that night with a sense of purpose. The farm was his, and he was ready to work hard to make it thrive. The stars shone brightly above, and he imagined himself working, planting, and building a life here for many years to come. For John, the abandoned farm was not just land, it was a chance to start over, a place to create, and a home where his dreams could grow. John woke up the next morning to the sound of birds singing and the faint rustle of the wind through the tall grass. He felt a renewed energy and was ready to continue his work. The first rays of the sun lit up the farmhouse and the fields beyond, and everything seemed peaceful. He saddled his horse, eager to check the fences and see which parts of the farm needed attention first. The air was crisp, and the smell of earth and wildflowers filled his lungs. For a moment, John felt that nothing could go wrong. He was finally living the life he had worked so hard for. As he rode toward the barn, he noticed something unusual. A thin trail of smoke rose into the clear blue sky. At first, John thought it might be from a neighbor or perhaps from a distant campfire, but the farm was isolated. No one lived near it anymore. Curious and slightly cautious, he guided his horse closer. The smoke came from behind the barn where the trees grew thicker and the grass was taller. His heart beat faster. Could someone else be on his land? He had expected loneliness, not unexpected visitors. Slowly, John dismounted and approached the barn quietly. The closer he got, the clearer it became that the smoke was real and that someone was tending it. He stepped lightly over the grass, his eyes scanning the area. Behind the barn, he found two women sitting near a small fire. One was tending it, adding small pieces of wood, while the other was arranging some herbs in a small basket. They looked up at him, startled, their eyes wide with surprise and caution. John froze for a moment. He had not expected anyone to be living on the farm. "Hello," he said carefully, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. I just bought this farm. I didn't know anyone else was here." His voice was calm but firm. The women exchanged a quick glance. Then the taller one spoke. "This land, we've been living here for some time. It was abandoned, and we had no other place to go." Her voice was steady but cautious. John could see the strength in her eyes. She was independent, capable, and determined. The other woman, smaller and quieter, nodded in agreement, keeping her hands busy with the herbs but watching John closely. John took a deep breath. He realized that this was an unexpected situation, one he had never imagined when he dreamed of owning the farm. Still, he knew he had to handle it with care. "I didn't know anyone was here. I didn't know anyone was here," he said again. "I understand if you've made this place your home, but now that I own it, I think we should talk about how to live here together." He tried to keep his tone friendly, but inside, he was nervous. The taller woman who introduced herself as Mariah studied him for a long moment. "Desk." Then she spoke. "We do not want trouble," she said. "We have survived here because it is quiet, and no one has bothered us. We are not trying to take your land. We need a safe place to stay." Her words were honest, and John could sense the truth in them. They were not trying to claim his farm. They were simply surviving. John felt a mix of relief and curiosity. He asked their names, and the smaller woman, Lila, shyly replied. They explained that they were Apache women who had been traveling for some time, moving from place to place to avoid trouble and find shelter. The farm, abandoned and quiet, had seemed like a safe spot. They had found food in the wild, collected water from a nearby stream, and used the barn for shelter during the nights. It was not luxurious, but it had kept them alive. John listened intently. He realized that they were not ordinary visitors. They were resilient and resourceful. They had survived on their own for months, relying on their skills and knowledge of the land. He admired their strength, though he knew he had to assert that this was now his property. "I can help you," he said after a pause. Breath. "I have tools, seeds, and the knowledge to fix the farm. If you are willing, we could work together. This land is big, and there is enough for all of us to thrive." Mariah and Lila looked at each other again. There was a long silence. Finally, Mariah spoke.
"We will listen, but we need to know that we will not be forced out."
"We are capable of working, and we can help. But we cannot be treated as guests or outsiders." Her tone was firm, and John could feel her determination. John nodded.
"I promise you that. We will work together, and we will respect each other."
Voices would rise slightly, and frustration sometimes showed on their faces. But slowly, they began to see that each person brought something valuable to the farm. One morning, John led the women into the fields to assess the soil for planting. The earth was dry in some areas, hard and cracked, while other patches were soft and fertile. John explained how he had learned to read the land from years of working as a ranch hand. Mariah listened carefully, nodding, and then added her own observations. She had noticed how water collected in certain low spots, and suggested planting crops that would benefit from that moisture. Lila quietly examined the soil near the small garden, pointing out which plants could grow there without much extra care. John realized that their knowledge of the land, combined with his own experience, could make the farm productive in ways he could not have done alone. By mid-morning, they had set up a plan for the day. John would repair the broken fences near the barn, while Mariah and Lila worked on clearing weeds and preparing the garden for planting. The work was physically demanding, but each of them approached it with determination. John lifted heavy posts and hammered them into place, feeling the satisfaction of progress. Mariah and Lila dug carefully through the soil, removing roots and stones, and arranging the beds for vegetables. Though they did not speak much while working, the silence was comfortable, filled with a shared understanding that everyone was contributing. During a short break, they gathered near the farmhouse to drink water and rest their muscles. John brought out a small bag of dried meat he had saved, and the women offered some herbs and dried fruits they had collected. They shared the food quietly, and in that simple moment, a bond began to form. It was not yet friendship in the full sense, but it was the beginning of trust, a recognition that each person could rely on the others to do their part.
John felt a warmth in his chest that he had not expected.
The farm, which he had imagined as a solitary refuge, was becoming something more. As the days passed, they developed routines that allowed them to work efficiently. In the mornings, they focused on physical tasks, repairing fences, clearing fields, and tending the barn. In the afternoons, they worked on planting crops and caring for the small garden. Mariah and Lila taught John how to use natural methods to improve the soil, how to identify edible plants, and how to conserve water. John, in turn, showed them how to fix broken tools, care for the animals, and plan for future seasons. Each task, no matter how small, became a learning experience. Evenings were a time for reflection and quiet companionship.
After a long day of work, they would sit near the fire in the barn, sharing stories of their pasts, dreams, and plans for the future. Mariah spoke of her family and the lessons she had learned about survival and resilience.
Lila shared memories of traveling through forests and deserts, of nights spent under the stars, and of the quiet joy she found in simple routines. John, in turn, spoke of his childhood, of his father's guidance, and of the dream that had led him to this farm. Though their stories were different, they found common ground in their love of the land and their desire for a life built on effort and honesty.
Challenges continue to arise.
A sudden storm one afternoon tore through the fields, flattening some of the newly planted crops and breaking a section of the barn roof. They worked together tirelessly to repair the damage, reinforcing the structure and replanting what they could. It was hard work, but it strengthened their trust in each other. John admired how the women faced adversity without complaint, and they admired his determination and problem-solving skills. Each obstacle became a lesson in cooperation, and each success a shared victory. One morning, as John was feeding the animals, he noticed Lila tending the garden with a careful, methodical approach. He stopped and watched her work, realizing how much she had contributed in just a few days. "You have a real talent for this," he said quietly. Lila looked up and smiled, a small, shy smile that showed her growing comfort with John. "I've always loved working with plants," she replied. "They need care, patience, like people sometimes." John nodded, understanding her meaning. Their respect for each other deepened, though it was quiet and unspoken. As weeks turned into months, the farm began to change. The overgrown fields became neat plots, ready for crops. The barn, though still old, was sturdy and organized. The small garden flourished with vegetables and herbs, and the animals were well cared for. Each morning, John, Mariah, and Lila would rise early and work until the sun began to set, exhausted but satisfied. The land, once abandoned and empty, was alive again. With the farm becoming productive, they also found small joys in daily life. They would sit outside in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the sky with brilliant colors. Sometimes they would take breaks to explore the surrounding hills, finding wildflowers, streams, and hidden groves of trees. They laughed at small mishaps, like spilling water while carrying it to the garden, or animals escaping from the barn. These moments, simple and quiet, were the beginnings of a home, one built not just of buildings and fields, but of shared effort and companionship. John found himself reflecting on how much had changed. When he first bought the farm, he had imagined solitude, a quiet life working alone on the land. Now, with Mariah and Lila, he realized that life could be richer when shared. They brought knowledge, strength, and companionship that he had not anticipated. Though challenges remained, he felt more capable because they worked together. Each person had their role, and together they created something greater than the sum of its parts. Even the nights, once silent and lonely, were now filled with the gentle sounds of life. The wind rustled through the trees, the animals stirred softly in the barn, and occasionally the women would quietly hum songs from their childhood. But John would listen, feeling a sense of peace he had never known. It was not the life he had imagined, perhaps, but it was a life full of purpose, connection, and hope. By the end of the season, the farm had transformed. The fields were planted and growing, the garden was thriving, and the barn was repaired and organized. John, Mariah, and Lila had not only learned to work together, but they had also learned to trust each other, to respect each other's skills, and to appreciate the unique strengths each person brought. They had become a small, functioning team, and in doing so, they had turned the abandoned farm into a home. As John lay in bed one evening listening to the distant calls of birds settling for the night, he thought about the journey so far. The farm, once lonely and silent, had become alive with work, purpose, and quiet companionship. He realized that his dream had not been about solitude, but about building something lasting. But now, with Mariah and Lila by his side, he felt that he was finally doing exactly that. By the time summer had arrived, the farm was starting to look like a place that could truly thrive. The fences were repaired, the garden was full of vegetables, and the fields were planted with crops that swayed gently in the warm breeze. John, Mariah, and Lila had settled into a routine, working together efficiently. Each day was long and tiring, but it was also rewarding. Yet, with the passing of time, the trio realized that life on the farm was not without its challenges. The land, once abandoned, had many hidden problems that needed constant attention.
One morning, John noticed that one of the fences surrounding the cow pasture had been damaged.
The wood had rotted in several spots, and part of it had collapsed during the previous night's windstorm. The cows were restless, grazing too close to the broken section. John sighed, knowing that fixing it would take the better part of the day. He called Mariah and Lila to help, and together they examined the fence. "This section is weak," John said, pointing to the rotted posts. "We need to replace it entirely, or the cows could wander off."
Mariah nodded, her brow furrowed in thought.
"We can use the stronger posts from the north field," she suggested. "They may be old, but they'll hold better than the ones here." Lila added quietly, "We should also clear the brush around it. The animals might get tangled in it if we don't." John smiled. Their teamwork was improving, and he felt grateful for their insight and careful planning. For the next several hours, they worked tirelessly. John carried heavy posts while Mariah and Lila hammered them into place. The sun beat down on their backs, and sweat dripped from their faces. But they didn't complain. Each swing of the hammer and each placement of the post brought a sense of accomplishment. By the time the fence was secure, their muscles ached. But the pasture was safe. The trio paused for a moment, leaning on their tools and looking at their work. The fence stood firm, a symbol of what they could accomplish together. Not long after, another challenge appeared. A sudden summer storm swept over the farm. Dark clouds rolled in quickly, and a fierce wind tore through the trees. Rain began to fall, heavy and relentless. John, Mariah, and Lila rushed to the barn, trying to secure the animals and protect the crops. The wind tore a section of the roof off the barn, letting water pour inside. Breath. They scrambled to move hay and feed away from the flooding, working side by side. Their hands were cold and wet, and their clothes clung to their bodies. But they didn't stop. Once the storm passed, they stepped outside to assess the damage. The garden was battered, several rows of crops flattened by the rain, and the barn roof needed urgent repairs. John felt a twinge of discouragement. It was frustrating to see the work they had done so far damaged in a single storm. But Mariah placed a hand on his shoulder. "We can fix this," she said calmly. "We've rebuilt worse. The farm is stronger than it was before."
We just need to start again. Lila nodded, helping John examine the roof and the flooded areas.
Their determination was inspiring. Over the next few days, they repaired the barn and reinforced the roof with extra support beams. Rasp. They cleared waterlogged soil from the garden and replanted the damaged crops. They worked from sunrise to sunset, often skipping breaks, but the shared effort brought them closer together. John began to realize that it was not just about restoring the farm. It was about resilience, perseverance, and learning to adapt. Each challenge became a lesson, teaching them to work smarter, plan ahead, and anticipate problems before they grew too large. One morning, John and Mariah were out in the field when they noticed a group of wild animals near the fence line. Rabbits and deer, and even a pair of foxes. The animals had been attracted to the crops, and they were beginning to damage the newly planted rows. John frowned. "We can't let this continue," he said.
Mariah agreed, suggesting they build small barriers and scare devices to protect the crops.
Lila joined them, adding that they could plant some herbs and plants that animals usually avoided along the edges of the fields. Together they crafted a plan to safeguard the crops without harming the wildlife. As the season progressed, the trio faced yet another challenge, maintaining the water supply. The small well behind the farmhouse sometimes ran low during the heat of summer. John, Mariah, and Lila took turns drawing water for the animals, the garden, and themselves. They dug small trenches to guide rainwater into storage barrels and learned how to conserve water while keeping the farm functioning. These tasks required patience, ingenuity, and cooperation. John admired how the women approached problems calmly and logically, using their knowledge of the land to create solutions he might never have thought of. Breaths. Through all these challenges, their bond strengthened. They learned each other's habits and preferences. John noticed that Mariah worked best in the mornings when she was fresh and focused, while Lila had a careful, methodical approach that shone in the afternoons. John himself was strongest when lifting heavy work, repairing fences, and managing the animals. By combining their strengths, they accomplished tasks efficiently and discovered a rhythm to life on the farm that felt both natural and rewarding. Evenings became a time for reflection and planning. After long days, they would sit near the fire in the barn, sharing stories of the day, discussing improvements for the farm, and sometimes quietly enjoying the silence. Breaths. John began to appreciate the small joys, the warmth of the fire, the taste of fresh vegetables from the garden, and the sound of the animals settling down for the night. Mariah and Lila, too, found comfort in the shared labor, the safety of the barn, and the knowledge that they were no longer entirely alone in the world. One particularly challenging day, a part of the old barn wall collapsed unexpectedly. The noise startled John, and for a moment he worried about their safety. Mariah and Lila quickly helped him move the animals to a safer area, while John secured the remaining structure. It was exhausting work, but by the end of the day, they had reinforced the wall and made plans to prevent further collapses. In that moment, John realized that the farm was teaching them patience, teamwork, and the importance of preparation. It was more than a dream. It was a lesson in resilience and growth. Despite the hardships, they also began to enjoy the rewards of their labor. The garden was thriving, full of vegetables and herbs. The animals were healthy and well fed. Even the barn, once fragile and broken, now stood strong against wind and weather. The farm, which had once seemed abandoned and hopeless, was now alive. John, Mariah, and Lila could look around and feel pride in what they had accomplished together. Their cooperation had transformed not just the land, but their own lives. As the weeks turned into months, the trio also began to understand each other better on a personal level. They discovered shared values: honesty, hard work, and respect for the land. They found moments of humor, laughing at small mishaps like spilling water or chasing runaway chickens. They discovered quiet joys: watching a sunset over the fields, finding a hidden patch of wildflowers, or simply sharing a meal after a long day of labor. These small experiences built a sense of family and connection that went beyond survival or work. By the end of the summer, the farm had not only recovered from its earlier challenges, but it had grown stronger. The fences were solid, the barn repaired, and the garden flourishing. The trio had faced storms, wild animals, water shortages, and structural damage, and they had overcome each obstacle together. John looked around the farm one evening, taking in the golden light of the setting sun, and felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The land was thriving, and so were the relationships that had formed upon it. John also began to reflect on the woman beside him. Mariah and Lila had proven to be capable, resilient, and resourceful. They had not only helped restore the farm, but they had also taught him new ways of understanding the land, approaching problems, and appreciating life's small joys. He realized that their presence had transformed the farm into more than just a place to work. It was a home. And it was a home built on cooperation, respect, and shared purpose. As the night settled over the farm, John, Mariah, and Lila sat outside looking at the stars. The air was warm but gentle, filled with the soft sounds of the farm settling after a long day. John felt a sense of contentment he had never known. The challenges they had faced had brought them closer, strengthened their resolve, and taught them the true meaning of hard work and partnership. The abandoned farm was no longer lonely or empty. It was alive, vibrant, and full of potential for the future. By the time autumn arrived, the farm had transformed completely. The fields were full of crops swaying in the golden sunlight. The garden produced fresh vegetables and herbs every day, and the barn, now fully repaired, stood tall and strong. John, Mariah, and Lila had developed a rhythm to life on the farm that made each day meaningful and productive. Work was still hard and challenges occasionally appeared, but now they had the confidence and experience to face anything together. One crisp morning, John walked through the fields, inspecting the crops with a sense of pride. The corn was tall and sturdy, the pumpkins were almost ready for harvest, and the small orchard of apple trees glowed with red and gold leaves. He paused to watch a group of birds hop through the garden, picking at the ripening vegetables. The sight made him smile. What had once been an abandoned, overgrown farm was now a living, thriving place. He thought about how far they had come since the first day he had arrived, and realized that this transformation was not just about the land, it was about the teamwork, patience, and determination that he, Mariah, and Lila had shared. The women were already busy when he returned to the farmhouse. Mariah was checking on the chickens in the coop, ensuring they had food and water, while Lila was collecting herbs and preparing a small basket of vegetables for the day's meals. They moved with confidence, knowing the farm and their routines well. John admired how capable they had become and how much knowledge and skill they had contributed. Together, they were not just surviving, they were building a life that was meaningful, productive, and harmonious. The trio spent the day harvesting some of the crops, repairing minor damage to fences, and preparing the barn for the coming winter. They worked efficiently, each knowing their role and supporting one another. John handled the heavy lifting and animal care. Mariah focused on organizing the barn and ensuring everything was in order, and Lila tended the garden and herbs with care and precision. Occasionally they would laugh at small mistakes: a spilled basket of apples, a stubborn post that refused to stay in place, or a chicken that had wandered too far. But these moments only strengthened their bond. In the afternoons, when the work slowed, they would take breaks under the shade of the trees near the farmhouse. They shared stories, plans, and dreams for the future. Mariah spoke about the places she had once traveled and how she hoped to plant a small orchard next year. Lila dreamed of expanding the garden with more flowers and herbs, hoping to attract bees and butterflies that would help the crops. John listened, offering suggestions and learning from their experiences. The conversations were simple, yet filled with hope and purpose. It was during these moments that John realized the true value of companionship. One day, a neighbor from the town came by to see the farm. The man had heard that John had bought the abandoned land and wanted to see the progress. As he walked through the fields and barns, he was amazed. "I never thought this place could be brought back," he said, shaking his head. "But look at it now, full of life, productive, and organized. You've done an incredible job." John smiled, but he knew the truth. It had not been his effort alone. Without Mariah and Lila, much of the work would have been impossible. Together, they had turned a neglected piece of land into a thriving farm. As the day ended, John, Mariah, and Lila sat outside on the porch of the farmhouse, watching the sunset behind the hills. The sky was painted in shades of orange, pink, and purple, reflecting off the golden fields. There was a calmness in the air, a sense that the farm was finally at peace. John felt a deep contentment. Breath was more than a dream realized. It was a life built through hard work, cooperation, and mutual respect. He looked at Mariah and Lila, noting the quiet satisfaction in their expressions. They had faced countless challenges, from storms and broken fences to water shortages and wild animals, yet they had persevered. Winter approached slowly, bringing colder temperatures and shorter days. The trio worked to prepare the farm, ensuring that the animals had warm shelter, the crops were harvested, and supplies were stored for the months ahead. They repaired any damage caused by early frosts and insulated the farmhouse as best they could. Even in the cold, their teamwork never faltered. They shared the labor equally, supporting one another through long hours and harsh conditions. By the time the first snow fell, the farm was ready. Snow covered the fields and rooftops, transforming the farm into a serene winter landscape. John, Mariah, and Lila spent the days tending to the animals and making small repairs. They also enjoyed moments of quiet reflection, sitting by the fire in the barn or farmhouse, sipping warm tea, and talking about the future. The hardships of the past months had brought them closer, teaching patience, resilience, and the value of shared effort. Each of them felt a sense of pride, not just in the farm, but in the life they had created together. Spring arrived again, and with it, new opportunities. The crops were planted once more, this time with the experience and knowledge gained over the past year. They experimented with new plants, improved irrigation, and expanded the garden. The animals thrived, and the barn, sturdy and well-maintained, provided a safe and comfortable home. The farm was no longer just surviving, it was flourishing. And with the flourishing farm came a flourishing sense of connection and belonging among John, Mariah, and Lila. One warm afternoon, they sat together under the apple trees, sharing a simple meal of fresh vegetables and baked bread. The air was filled with the scents of the orchard, the sound of birds in the trees, and the gentle hum of life on the farm. John looked around at the woman and felt gratitude. Mariah and Lila had not only helped him build the farm, they had helped him build a home, a life, and a sense of family. Their presence had transformed his dream into something far richer than he had ever imagined. Over time, the trio also began to consider the future beyond the farm itself. They discussed planting more trees, expanding the garden, and even creating small structures to attract bees and birds to the land. They planned for the next harvest, thinking about ways to preserve food for winter and improve the sustainability of their farm. Each plan reflected their shared commitment to the land and to each other. They were no longer three individuals working separately. They were a team, united by purpose, respect, and shared effort. By the end of the year, the farm had become a place of abundance, peace, and resilience. The once abandoned land was now a home in every sense. Crops thrived in the fields, animals were healthy, and the farmhouse and barn were sturdy and welcoming. John, Mariah, and Lila had built a life together that was both productive and fulfilling. They had faced every challenge with determination and had learned from each experience. In the process, they had formed a unique bond that went beyond friendship or teamwork. It was a connection built on trust, respect, and shared dreams. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in brilliant colors, John stood on the porch of the farmhouse and looked over the fields. He saw Mariah tending the chickens and Lila arranging fresh herbs in the kitchen. The barn was quiet but secure, and the fields glowed in the fading light. He felt a sense of fulfillment that was deeper than anything he had known before. This farm was no longer just a place of work or a dream. It was home, and it was alive with purpose, care, and connection. For John, the journey had begun with a simple dream, to own a farm and live a peaceful life. But the reality had been far richer and more complex. He had discovered that life was not meant to be lived alone, that strength was multiplied when shared, and that the land itself could teach lessons about patience, resilience, and cooperation. Mariah and Lila had been unexpected companions, but they had become essential to the farm's success and to the life that John now cherished. In the quiet of the night, with the stars twinkling above and the farm resting peacefully, John, Mariah, and Lila felt a deep sense of belonging. The farm had tested them, challenged them, and forced them to grow. But in the end, it had given them a life full of accomplishment, friendship, and hope. Together, they had turned an abandoned piece of land into a thriving farm and a home, proving that dreams could become reality when met with hard work, cooperation, and trust. As the seasons continued, the farm remained a place of life and vitality. John, Mariah, and Lila continued to work, learn, and grow together, each day building on the successes and lessons of the past. The abandoned farm had become more than a property. It had become a symbol of resilience, community, and the rewards of shared effort. And in that place, amidst the fields, barns, and garden, they had found something even more valuable than a farm. They had found a home and a life worth living. I just want this farm to be alive again, and I see that you both have the knowledge and courage to help make that happen. The women studied him for a moment. Then slowly, they nodded. Psst. An unspoken agreement began to form between them. Over the next few hours, John walked them through the farmhouse and the barn, pointing out areas that needed repair. He showed them the old tools he had found and explained his plans for the land. Mariah and Lila listened carefully, occasionally offering suggestions. Lila pointed out which plants could be grown in certain parts of the garden, while Mariah identified areas where the soil could be prepared for crops. John was impressed. They knew the land as well as he did, or maybe even better, because they had lived here when no one else had. As they worked together, John began to feel a sense of connection with the women. It was not friendship yet, but it was a start. They respected each other's skills, listened to one another, and understood that cooperation was necessary. By the afternoon, the fire they had found in the morning was replaced by a small, organized cooking area, and some of the barn's broken sections were examined to see what repairs were needed first. The farm was slowly taking shape as a place where people could live, not just survive. During a break, John sat down with them near the fire and asked about their past. They told him stories of traveling through the hills and deserts, of finding shelter in abandoned cabins, and of surviving harsh weather. They spoke of loneliness, of nights spent under the stars, and of relying on each other for strength. John listened with fascination. He realized that these women had endured hardships far greater than anything he had faced. Their courage and independence impressed him, and he felt a deep respect for them. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the fields, John realized how much this farm had already changed in just one day. It was no longer completely abandoned. With the women's presence, it had life again. The barn, though old and broken, had warmth. The fields, though untended, had hope, and John, though initially cautious, felt a sense of anticipation. This was not what he had imagined when he first dreamed of owning a farm. But perhaps it was even better. The women prepared a simple meal by the fire, using wild herbs and some dried grains they had collected. John watched, fascinated by their skills and efficiency. Though he was a cowboy used to working alone, he felt a sense of camaraderie forming. There was a rhythm to their movements, a shared understanding that they were all here to survive and thrive. It was a partnership, tentative, but promising. That night, John lay in the farmhouse, listening to the soft sounds of the wind and the crackling fire from the barn. He thought about the unexpected turn his life had taken. He had bought a farm expecting solitude, hard work, and peace, but he had found something else entirely. He had found two strong, independent women who had claimed a part of his land, yet who could also become allies, teachers, and companions in this new life. John felt a mixture of emotions: surprise, curiosity, and cautious hope.
He knew the coming days would be challenging.
They would need to build trust, establish boundaries, and work together to make the farm functional. But for the first time in a long while, he felt excitement beyond just owning land. He felt the potential for community, for shared effort, and for a life that was richer because it included others. As he drifted to sleep, John realized that the abandoned farm had more stories than he could ever have imagined. It had witnessed years of neglect. Yet now it was alive again, not just because of him, but because of the women who had already made it their home. And in that quiet night under the stars and the gentle hum of nature, John felt that this unexpected meeting was not a problem to solve. It was a beginning. The next morning promised new challenges, but John was ready. He was ready to face the work, the surprises, and the shared life that was beginning to take shape on this once-forgotten farm. And somewhere in the distance, the women watched the sunrise too, feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, the stranger who had come to their land might become more than just an owner. He might become part of the life they had been quietly building, even if neither of them knew exactly how yet. After the first few days, the rhythm of life on the farm began to settle into a steady pace. John rose early each morning, even before the sun had fully risen, and made his way to the barn to check on the animals and prepare for the work ahead. Mariah and Lila, having grown accustomed to living off the land, were already up and moving, gathering firewood or checking the small garden they had started near the farmhouse. The morning air was fresh, carrying the scent of earth and wildflowers, and the soft hum of birds in the trees. For John, it was a moment of peace, a quiet that felt almost sacred. At first, working together was not easy. John was used to managing his own routines, making decisions quickly, and working at his own pace. Mariah and Lila had their own ways of doing things, shaped by months of survival and living independently. Sometimes they disagreed on how to approach tasks. Mariah would insist on one method for repairing a fence, while John preferred another. Lila would carefully plant seeds in neat rows, while John suggested a different arrangement. At first, these differences led to tension,